Thank you so very much for being here. Thanks to all of you, really, for carving out time for being here with us today. I have a little note, a bit of housekeeping to share with you before we even get started, particularly for those who are watching us online today. If you would like to follow the session in any of the 6 languages of the United Nations, you can select the language channel in the box to the right of your video window. It is very important that when you do so, you actually mute the microphone, because otherwise you're going to be hearing the original language and at the same time the interpretation. There is a short video at the reception lounge that will explain to you how to do this if you have any issues. So let me welcome you, please, to this session, which is about financing local investment through risk-informed and bankable strategies. We know very well that investing in disaster risk reduction is a complete precondition to sustainable development, isn't it? And we also know that that investment must reach local communities and local governments if we are serious about impact. We also know that investment that is very much responsive to gender, age, and disabilities is crucial. And we know that because we know that these social groups get particularly affected, and they get affected in differentiated manners. Studies indicate that for every $1 that is invested in women and gender programming, the benefit can amount to 1.5 up to $150. So there is return in that investment. We also know that there are an incredible number of successful experiences out there that are allowing grassroots communities to self-develop financial mechanisms to help increase the pre-disaster investment. The question, however, remains, how can these examples be increased and scaled up to the level that we actually need? We also know that this is the urbanization century. We tend to say that, isn't it? Particularly in the Global South. And therefore, local financing for resilience must be increased to underpin the social, economic, and infrastructure developments that are occurring in urban areas in the Global South. Financing needs in cities are estimated at about $4.5 to $5.4 trillion annually. But if we do now a reality check, we know that climate finance flows for cities have reached an average of only $380 billion in 2017 and 2018. So, how can local governments and communities work together to better access financing that empowers the most vulnerable in decision-making? How can civil society and women's organizations influence finance decisions and policy-making? What are the emerging trends for increasing the financing at the local level? And global, national, community levels, what type of actions can they actually carry out to strengthen the capacities and the capabilities of local governments to better project portfolios in the areas of disaster risk reduction and resilience? So it's very much against this backdrop that our panelists are going to be addressing the topic of local investment. I am Marusha Kardama. I am the Secretary General of the Slow Cut Partnership on Sustainable Low Carbon Transport. But as you can see, I'm not alone here. It is actually an honor to be here today with you, and I would like to thank the government of Indonesia and UNDRR for giving me the opportunity of being part of this amazing panel and hopefully getting to you all the wonderful experience that these very relevant speakers are going to be sharing with you. Let me introduce them to you briefly so you can know who's there. So in video, we will have with us Rocco Guarino, who is the president of the province of Potenza in Italy. He couldn't finally travel, but we have the great news of having with us Alessandro Attolico, who is the executive director for territorial planning, digital transformation, and resilience in the province of Potenza. To my left, we have with us Same Waba, who is the global director for urban disaster risk management, resilience, and land in the global practice on those topics at the World Bank. To my immediate left, we have with us Tissa Mafira, who is the Associate Director of the Climate Policy Institute in Jakarta. And last but not very least at all, to my right, we have with us Godabri Dange, who is a grassroots leader from the SSP. So as you can see, different views, wonderful things here that are going to happen. let me do something very quickly. You know who we are. We want to know who you are. So let's do something relatively quick. Tell me who is from the Asia region, Asia-Pacific region. Raise your hand. Good. African colleagues in the room? Okay. North Americans, Europeans? Latin Americans? Good, a few hands. Okay, let's continue this. People from local communities. Local government? A few more hands. Multilateral system. Finance institutions, not only from the multilateral system, but others. Philanthropies. Academia. Private sector. Students, researchers, perhaps? I left anybody out? Governments, national governments? Non-profits? Good. I'm making you participate on purpose. Good. So we know more or less who we have in the room. Thank you very much for giving me the opportunity, you know, of keeping you a bit awake after lunch and knowing who we got. So with no further ado, we're going to listen to Mr. Rocco Guarino, who I've already introduced to you as the president of the province of Potenza. We have a pre-recorded statement from him, and you will see that he will share very interesting things of what is happening in that province in Italy. So, video in, please.
Onorati ospiti, gentili partecipanti, stimato Presidente, prima di tutto vorrei formularle i miei ringraziamenti all'UNDRR e al Governo dell'Indonesia per avermi invitato a tenere il messaggio di indirizzo su questo tema cruciale. Le strategie di finanziamento per lo sviluppo locale, il tema è ancora più attuale e strategico se si considera che il pianeta sta progressivamente uscendo da un periodo molto critico, l'emergenza Covid-19, il cui superamento necessita di una visione chiara di strategie di ripresa ben definite e di un uso più efficace ed efficiente delle risorse economiche. La sfida principale è come ricostruire meglio sulle esperienze e sugli errori passati, come essere davvero resilienti a qualsiasi shock e stress, come costruire un mondo migliore. Nonostante quanto fatto negli anni, il Covid-19 ha dimostrato che in realtà non eravamo del tutto preparati a un disastro di questa portata. C'è ancora molto lavoro da fare e questo lavoro non può essere fatto senza un'analisi seria di ciò che è stato sbagliato in passato e deve essere migliorato in futuro. La questione chiave è investire ampiamente nella conoscenza e nella prevenzione e preparazione al rischio di catastrofi, in modo da garantire un terreno più fattibile e sicuro per gli investimenti nello sviluppo socio-economico. Ciò deve basarsi su un processo di grande impegno politico, consapevole dei rischi che interessi i governi a tutti i livelli e che prevede il coinvolgimento inclusivo di tutti i settori, delle comunità e dei cittadini. Conoscere i rischi è fondamentale per chi opera sullo sviluppo urbano e territoriale. Anche i gruppi sociali di cittadini, che sono i principali destinatari di questo sviluppo, devono essere adeguatamente consapevoli nell'ampio spettro di possibili minacce. Il primo requisito è avere una visione chiara, ambiziosa e di lungo termine, una strategia e degli obiettivi chiaramente definiti che assicurano l'allineamento con le strategie nazionali nelle azioni e nei progetti. Questo si traduce in un piano di azione per lo sviluppo sostenibile e resiliente. Il secondo elemento è garantire l'innovazione, ricercare, analizzare ed importare le buone pratiche che hanno funzionato altrove è un passo decisivo da valutare e adottare. Altro fattore è assicurare la capacità tecnica, economica e finanziaria dell'azione. Che si tratti di un progetto specifico o di un piano di rigenerazione urbana, devono essere effettuate analisi costi-benefici, analisi di rischio rispetto alle alternative possibili. Devono essere condotti studi di fattibilità che considerino i costi di manutenzione per includere nel modello finanziario da adottare. Si deve avere piena conoscenza delle possibili fonti di finanziamento locali, nazionali, internazionali, privati, valutando anche la possibilità di attrarre investimenti innovativi. In molti casi la conoscenza dell'esistenza di specifiche fonti di finanziamento e la capacità di attrarle riescono da solo ad avviare il processo di miglioramento in alcuni settori, come per le infrastrutture strategiche. Nella mia esperienza questo sta funzionando molto per quanto riguarda i finanziamenti nazionali e comunitari, per i quali queste skill giocano un ruolo fondamentale in piattaforme competitive così vaste. Infine, ma non meno importante, devono essere valutati e assicurati i co-benefici sociali e di altra natura. Dobbiamo chiederci l'azione che proponiamo è davvero inclusiva e quali impatti sociali hanno i suoi benefici. Il progetto ha un impatto positivo su un'ampia parte di popolazione, compresi i gruppi più vulnerabili. L'azione ha ricadute positive in altri settori socio-economici e sostiene benefit locali come lavoro, occupazione, investimenti. Porta altri benefici per il territorio, l'azione rappresenta davvero un pezzo del più strategico e ambizioso puzzle dello sviluppo socio-economico locale. La combinazione strutturata di questi elementi è ciò che per esperienza sta funzionando come strategia di sicuro successo per stimolare e finanziare lo sviluppo socio-economico locale sostenibile e resiliente. Negli ultimi 20 anni con questo approccio abbiamo finanziato per diversi milioni di euro progetti complessi di miglioramento della sicurezza e delle prestazioni delle principali infrastrutture, nello specifico strade e scuole. Significativi investimenti sono stati dedicati anche agli ecosistemi, alla tutela ambientale, alla biodiversità e alla transizione digitale. Le sfide future ci vedono impegnati in sperimentazioni di forme di coinvolgimento del settore privato, come la partnership pubblico-privato e pubblico-privato popolazione, il project finance, le sponsorizzazioni, le perequazioni urbane e territoriali e di finanza innovativa, come la partnership di cooperazione transregionale, per l'esecuzione di interventi che vanno dalla mitigazione dei cambiamenti climatici e dei rischi di catastrofe fino agli investimenti in resilienza socio-economica. Interventi e programmi che coniugano politiche di sviluppo sostenibili con la sicurezza territoriale e climatica. Sono alla base delle politiche di resilienza territoriale che abbiamo delineato nei nostri strumenti di pianificazione strategica, con lo scopo anche di orientare ed influenzare le scelte urbanistiche alla scala comunale. Ho accolto con grande gratitudine ed entusiasmo la nomina della provincia di Potenza come hub della resilienza nella iniziativa globale delle Nazioni Unite Making City Resilient 2030. Sulla base di questo riconoscimento ufficiale, la provincia di Potenza continuerà a guidare e sostenere il proprio territorio e sarà inoltre lieta di confrontarsi con altri governi locali, città e comunità che intendono intraprendere simili percorsi di resilienza. Così, attraverso una cooperazione ambiziosa e politicamente guidata, avremo la possibilità di condividere esperienze e soluzioni operative di successo e quindi di aumentare gli investimenti e le opportunità di crescita per i nostri territori. Auguro un buon lavoro per il prosieguo della sezione tematica. Grazie a tutti.
Thank you so very much, and we certainly need to thank the President for sharing with us all those very specific notions, isn't it? He talked about risk-aware political commitment at the very beginning. So that is, I think, very important words to bear in mind, and we should congratulate the province of Potenza, Alessandro, for that award, for being selected as that a resilience hub. I know we're going to have more opportunity to hear from you during the question and answers, so thanks very much. So, a little announcement. I hope that by now there's a lot of questions and comments already, starting to come in your head. As you might have experienced already in other rooms, the way it works is through a digital platform where for in-room participants, you can connect to slido.com using your digital device. And once you are there, you need to introduce the code that is being showed on the screen, the code you got there, 0447294. And it is from the function that you will find there that you will be able to put your questions to all of us. For those of participants who are following through Hopin online, they need to introduce their questions through the poll and questions and answers, which is in the right-hand side menu. If you have any difficulties while trying to go into Slido, just raise your hand and somebody in the room will support you. Equally, participants joining us online, they can actually benefit from support and they can ask for it in the chat. So, with no further ado, I'm going to go to you, Sami. I mean, it's many decades now of talking about innovation, isn't it, in financial mechanisms, of talking about the trends that are telling us about those innovative mechanisms. But things have been moving at a different pace recently, isn't it? So I wanted to share with us a bit, what are those emerging trends you are seeing? What are those innovative financial mechanisms that you think are really going in the right direction for increasing the availability of financing and investment that go to communities and to cities in developing projects that are bankable? What can you share there?
Thanks, Marusha. So I think we're having a situation where there is a tremendous amount of need in terms of scaling up financing for both resilience and climate action in general. So we know now that more or less every decade of inaction is going to imply basically $1 trillion worth of deferred investment. So I mean, there is an imperative to act and to act fast as far as scaling up climate action. At the same time, against this backdrop of a major investment need, there are innovative instruments that are starting to surface. There are innovative trends as well within the international community. So among other things, there's an increasing trend of obviously financing institutions, not just the concessional type, but obviously private sector financing institutions that are embracing stricter environmental and social requirements. Again, I mean, multilateral institutions have played a role in there, like the IFC, the International Finance Corporation's Equator Principles, and increasing number of investment funds are also incorporating these development objectives within their mission statements. Now, of course, there's a lot of investors, individuals, institutional, that are becoming much more green-focused and seeking that investment funds, deploy their savings, their pensions, etc., in greener portfolios, including divestment from polluting industries and sectors. We also know that, within climate finance, that incorporating climate risk is becoming a critical dimension within investment funds and fund managers' portfolios. It's no longer nice to do dimensions. It's becoming an imperative in terms of safekeeping these investments. Now, there are also additional instruments that are particularly innovative, one of which we've deployed at the World Bank Group. It's a sort of contingent financing or line of credit that is availed to countries to be able to offset investments in arising from disasters. But this financing or line of credit, the access to it is conditioned on increased investment in risk reduction and preparedness. So basically, it's a trade-off. As a country prepares better, it has the financial means that could avail it, to draw on this line of credit when a disaster happens, instead of reallocating from health and education type budgets. We also know that both at the municipal and public finance level, we're having much more investment in green bonds. I mean, we're talking about over $500 billion in 2021. And basically, cities and national governments are now focusing on presenting their investment plans in a way that can attract investors, so with a focus on basically greening their investment portfolios with a focus on incorporating climate risk. Lastly, maybe my last one that I wanted to bring in is trying to learn from what investments happened or progress happened within the climate mitigation space to inform the resilience space. So for instance, in climate mitigation, we have a situation now around energy efficiency investments where the cost savings arising from, let's say, replacing mercury and sodium lights with energy efficient lighting, just the cost saving arising from that investment, it is capable of paying off for the investment over the entirety of the investment time frame. So this idea of trying to monetize basically cost savings or increased in urbanization value, the most important of which is land value capture, which is when the price of land increases on account of an investment in urbanization or an investment in risk reduction, like flood embankments, etc., would increase the cost of land, and you can draw a portion of that valorization to pay for the infrastructure investment needs. So all these innovative financial trends are helping us avail a portfolio of solutions, although, as I said earlier, the needs are immense.
No, thanks a lot, Sami, and it's of course very rewarding to hear that notion of principles and safeguards, it's so central right now, isn't it? And a sort of conditionality, the more you prepare, the better or easier access you could get, isn't it, to certain monies in certain moments of difficulty. You've mentioned already learning from the mitigation mechanisms to bring them to the wider adaptation and resilience. So how do you think these type of mechanisms can help us implement the Sendai framework and the Paris Agreement on climate change?
Excellent. So just, I know you called it conditionality, but given
I know
some
it's not
history,
a conditionality.
I think it's better to call it an incentive.
Sure.
But I mean, so how can we really scale up action towards the Sendai framework? I think, what is critical right now, and as those of us who are trying to come here today to the venue have seen, with the torrential rain that were happening, the importance of investing in resilience. I think it's important for cities to start thinking about incorporating risk into both planning and decision-making processes. So, I mean, there are investment needs that are needed, that cities will need in terms of complementing the infrastructure that's needed, but how do we transform this, and how do we incorporate, climate risk, and things like the climate variability, the temperature variability, the increasing rainfall variability, etc., and how do we incorporate these into technical designs, into business models, into performance expectations, becomes really critical. Again, you might have situations where cost might increase a little bit incrementally, other situations cost might increase even more so, but it is critical to incorporate these dimensions in order to ensure that we're climate proofing that infrastructure and the investments in the future. Now, some of these, when we're talking about, investing in flood defenses, we need also to be able to access the type of data that helps us better incorporate this risk into decision-making processes. And that need for reliable data that could help us in terms of analysis, in terms of forecasting, also in terms of thinking about cost-effective solutions, so that we can incorporate this uncertainty, of when or to what extent a disaster may occur and what severity it might have. And then, of course, we need to think about long-term financial solutions that are viable, commercial solutions, but at the same time, we know that some of these investments will require governments to intervene on their own balance sheets to be able to provide these investments. So it's not that everything has a private sector solution out there. There are global public goods, there are investments that are needed by the public sector to pave the way then for an increased investment. So being able to incorporate all this, and especially when we're talking about cities, it's in a context of more fragile municipal finances requiring, again, national government to intervene and structure the system. So it's all to say there's a lot to be done, but being able to strengthen the capacity for planning, be able to help more cities and national governments incorporate upstream interventions so that they could help create more bankable projects, more shovel-ready type investments. All that work is needed in order to be able to allow the Sendai framework to have a chance of being achieved. I think the ingredients are all out there, but we all need to start rowing together in that same direction.
Thank you so very much, Sami. So let's go to TISA now. So clearly this is all about trying to increase the capabilities and the capacities of local governments and accelerate, isn't it, that learning. What do you think the national, the global and the community levels could be doing to increase those capacities and capabilities in the local governments and local communities?
Yes, thank you, Marusha. This is a great segue from what Sami was explaining, because Sami was explaining the supply of finance, right? That there's really progress made in making finance more innovative, increasing the supply of finance available for resilience and adaptation. But I would say, supply needs a place to flow. It needs demand. And that means that projects need to be available for financing. So I've heard that, this characterization that it's like the chicken and egg. Do we make finance available so that the projects will appear? Or do we create projects so that finance is available? And I would like to say that there's whichever way that you would like to choose on that, but there's much, much, much more that can be done to make projects available, and the government, local governments play a central role in doing that. So I have three things that I believe would strengthen the capacity of governments. Number one is that local governments need adaptation and resilience impact metrics. We have clear mitigation metrics. Mitigation is translated into emissions reductions targets. It's translated to targets at the central government level, at the local government level, and that is translated into budgets, government budgets. It unlocks public finance. Now, adaptation does not have the same privilege. What are the indicators of success for adaptation and resilience? It's a little bit more complicated. And I would say that it is also local and contextual. So first of all, we need local and contextual climate risk data. Then we need to decide local and contextual solutions to that risk. Then we need to project the financial needs to finance those solutions. Then we need to decide what would be the potential reduced risk of taking those actions. Then that would be an impact metric that the government could act on, right? But most importantly, this all needs to be transparent. It needs to be accessible. It can't be just something the government knows or the researchers know. It needs to be, the private sector needs to be able to see this data. The public needs to be able to see this data because we need to reduce information asymmetries and knowledge gaps so that, as many stakeholders as possible are understanding, okay, these are the risks and these are the solutions and these are what we can do about it. Number two is that governments need to prepare interventions for bankability of these projects. And this will unlock private finance. So at the moment, there's very, very low private sector participation in adaptation. CPI made a study in 2020. There was $46 billion in adaptation finance, and 98% of that came from the public sector. So there's very, very little private sector finance. So what this means is that governments need to intervene. They need to de-risk adaptation projects. And there's various financial incentives, various financial schemes. Sameh has mentioned some of them, from tax breaks to benefits, guarantees, enhancement, concessional loans, and so on. I would say, great, but these interventions don't necessarily need to be innovative. At some point, these interventions need to be big, boring, and repetitive, okay? If something works, if there's 100 recipients already receiving this innovative mechanism, let's bring it up to 1 million, 2 million recipients and stop calling it innovative. Just call it something that needs to be done in mainstream. Number three, governments could create demand for resilient goods and services, utilizing local wisdom, small-scale solutions. Jakarta's great adaptation project is a giant seawall. I don't think adaptation projects need always to be giant seawalls. There are a lot of small-scale solutions. It could mean that there are districts in Indonesia that have started thinking about food security, reducing food waste, making sure that fruits that have no utility, like mangrove fruits, can be utilized as food. Snakehead fish, ikan gabus in Indonesian, that live in peatlands can be utilized for various kinds of food, and that increases. That's local wisdom, but it increases the resilience of the sector. Katingan district has made participatory spatial planning by making housing and jetty structures made of wood and bamboo. These are low-cost, local solutions that need demand from the market. And I think government can play a role, whether through procurement or whether through public campaigns or public policy signals, to create a demand for these kinds of resilient goods and services.
Wow, the perfect recipe almost there. But now, what are the challenges? What
Sure.
have you seen being the challenges in cities? How does it look like when you really go to the ground and you try, to support a city to make all these happen?
Yeah, we did have an experience helping West Java province creating a project pipeline for project pipeline for financeable projects for climate action, basically. And when we looked at the list and we made a short list of green project pipelines, we found that most of them were mitigation. And the question that was continuously asked to us was, how do we have limited fiscal capacity. We need to prioritize out of this list of 30 projects. We need to prioritize which ones. How do we prioritize? Can you just show us which ones have the potential to reduce emissions, most emissions, right? With less, with the least cost, which is fine. That's cost effectiveness and whatnot. But you notice there's no adaptation and resilience metrics in there. And that's something that's truly needed. The second thing that we noticed was that the government had no idea of what kind of financial mechanisms were available. The first thing they said and asked us is, what kind of public-private partnership solution can we utilize to finance these projects? And that's just one mechanism, right? They had no idea which banks could potentially provide services, no idea which development institutions could potentially provide concessional loans, and so on. So there needs to be, we need to close the knowledge gap. The private sector needs to know where the projects are.
Excellent.
The project proponents needs to know where the financing is.
Brilliant. Thank you so very much. And the point you've just made about knowledge, we heard it from the president, isn't it, Alessandro? Pointing at that importance of the knowledge. I loved it. You gave us a tweet. Big, boring, repetitive projects. Excellent. So we're going to go now to Godabri, who is going to share with us the amazing work that her and her colleagues are doing, as grassroots leaders. And in an initial recorded video, Godabri is going to be, you will see her addressing for us the question of how can civil society and women organizations access finance for local disaster risk reduction strategies and influence decision making. And after that video, we will have the opportunity of asking Godabri another question and hearing from her directly here live. So video in, please.
नमस्कार, माझं नाव गोदावरी डांगे आहे आणि मी इंडियामधून आहे, महाराष्ट्रामधून उस्मानाबाद जिल्ह्यातली आहे. फेडरेशनची अध्यक्ष आहे आणि वायरो कमिशनची मेंबर आहे. वायरो कमिशन हे 45 देशामध्ये 1 मिलियन महिलांसोबत, ग्रामीण आणि शहरी महिलांसोबत काम करते. मी जे मराठवाड्यामध्ये राहते, तर मराठवाड्यामधली अशी परिस्थिती आहे की दुष्काळ भाग आहे. या 4-5 वर्षामध्ये दुष्काळ हा आमच्याकडे 12 ते 16 पर्यंतचा खूप मोठा दुष्काळ होता. आणि ह्या दुष्काळामध्ये आम्हाला खूप साऱ्या अडचणी होत्या की जसं जनावरांना पाणी नव्हतं, माणसांना पिण्यासाठी पाणी नव्हतं, अन्न मिळत नव्हतं आणि बरेच लोक मायग्रेट होत होते. आणि ह्याच्यामध्ये आम्ही ज्या महिला आहेत, ज्या लीडर महिला आहेत, तर आम्ही आमच्या फेडरेशन मधून जवळपास आम्ही 7000 महिलांसोबत काम करते. स्वयं शिक्षण प्रयोग संस्था आणि आम्ही फेडरेशन मधून जे CRF फंड आहे, कम्युनिटी रेझिलियन्स फंड, तर आम्ही ज्या महिला आमच्या आहेत, तर ह्या महिलांना पूर्ण आम्ही महिलाच मॅनेज करतात की हा फंड कशासाठी द्यायला पाहिजे, कुठल्या कारणासाठी द्यायला पाहिजे. आणि आमच्याकडे नॉलेज आहे आणि आम्ही अनुभव आहे, तर हे सोबत आम्ही घेऊन फंडाचं डिझाईन केलेलं आहे. आणि हा फंड आम्ही कुठल्या कारणासाठी वापर करायला पाहिजे की जसं जनावराचा चारा आहे, परत भाजीपाला व्यवसाय करायचा आहे, कोंबडी पालन आहे, शेळी पालन आहे. एक तर महिलांनी चांगल्या प्रकारे काम केल्यामुळं जे आपत्ती आमच्याकडे आहे, तर हे आपत्ती आम्हाला इतकी जास्त भेडसावत नाही, जाणवत नाही. तर आपत्ती कमी करण्यासाठी आम्ही हा रेझिलियन्स फंड देतो. आणि ह्याच्यामध्ये आता कोविड तर सगळ्या जगभरामध्ये झालेला आहे, तर हा कोविड कोविडच्या काळामध्ये सुद्धा आम्ही जे गाव पातळीवर ज्या आमच्या लीडर महिला आहेत, तर आम्ही महिलांना सोबत घेऊन, तर महिलांसोबत आम्ही जसं की त्यांना मास्क बनवणे आहे, त्याच्यामध्ये परत किराणा दुकान असेल, भाजीपाला व्यवसाय आहे, जे गाव पातळीवर गावात बसून चालणारे व्यवसाय, तर अशा व्यवसायांसाठी आम्ही मदत केली. आणि जे आम्ही हे जे काम करत आहेत, तर ह्या कामाला सोबत घेऊन की जे गव्हर्नमेंट सोबत पार्टनरशिप आहे, की जसं जिल्ह्याचे कृषी डिपार्टमेंट आहे, आत्मा आहे, कृषी विज्ञान केंद्र आहे, तर ह्यांच्यासोबत आम्ही पार्टनरशिप केल्यामुळे आम्हाला त्यांच्या ज्या काही योजना आहेत शासनाच्या, जर एखादं उदाहरण बघितलं तर आम्ही ड्रीप कमी दुष्काळामध्ये कमी पाण्यावर शेती करण्यासाठी ड्रीप करायला पाहिजे, पण त्याच्यासाठी शासनाची भरपूर स्कीम आहे. तर हे स्कीम कसं मिळालं पाहिजे म्हणून आम्ही त्याच्यामध्ये गव्हर्नमेंटला लिंक करून त्यांच्यासोबत पार्टनरशिप करून आम्ही ही योजना लोकांपर्यंत पोहोचवण्यासाठी काम करतात. पण जवळपास आम्ही जे हे फंड देतात, पण हे आमचा फंड फक्त आमच्या पुरता मर्यादित नसून वायरो कमिशन हे इंडोनेशिया आहे, आफ्रिका आहे, तर ह्या ठिकाणी पण हा फंड दिलेला आहे. तर आम्ही एक्सचेंज केली इंडिया आफ्रिका आणि त्याच्यामध्ये बघितलं की आमचा फंड देण्याची सिस्टम आणि त्यांची फंड देण्याची सिस्टम काय आहे. तर आम्ही जे हे काम दुष्काळामध्ये असेल, कोविडमध्ये असेल, आम्ही जे काम केलेलं आहे, तर त्याचा जो परिणाम आहे, तो परिणाम की एक महिलांच्या हातामध्ये फंड आला, दुसरं की त्यांची आर्थिक परिस्थिती सुधारणा झाली आणि आपत्तीच्या काळात सहज त्यांना पैसे उपलब्ध झाले. आणि नाविन्यपूर्ण काम करत असल्यामुळे, जसं मास्क बनवणं आहे, हे महिलांनी स्वतः बनवले, तर ते नवीन काम केल्यामुळं किंवा बियाणे बनवले असतील, बँक असेल, तर हे असे नवीन काम केल्यामुळं इतरांना एक दाखवण्यासाठी पण झालं आणि स्वतः महिला त्याच्यामध्ये शिकल्या आणि दुसऱ्यांना पण शिकवल्या. तर अशा ज्या आमच्या महिलांनी नाविन्यपूर्ण काम केलेलं असेल, दुष्काळात असेल, आपत्तीत असेल, तर हे त्यांच्या एक सक्सेस स्टोऱ्या समोर आल्या. आणि म्हणून आज मग आम्ही आमचं एवढं चांगल्या पद्धतीचं काम आहे, तर आम्ही हे पुढे घेऊन करायला लागला. आम्ही काम केलेलं आहे की महिलांची अशी क्षमता आहे की कुठल्याही आपत्तीच्या काळात किंवा कुठल्याही परिस्थितीमध्ये महिला चांगल्या प्रकारे काम करू शकतात. आणि तर हे आहे. आणि जे आम्ही ग्रामीण भागातल्या ज्या महिला आहेत, तर त्यांच्या हातात जर फंड आला तर ते कुठल्याही परिस्थितीला मात करून आणि त्याच्यामध्ये जे चांगले निर्णय आहेत, तर ते निर्णय त्या स्वतः घेऊ शकतात. दुसरं आहे की महिलांचं संघटन मजबूत होतं ह्याच्यामुळं. त्यांच्या हातात पैसे आल्यामुळं महिलांचं संघटन त्या मजबूत करतात. जे काही ग्लोबल लेवलला फंड भरपूर असतो, पण तो फंड महिलांपर्यंत मिळत नाही किंवा लोकल लेवलला येत नाही. आणि हे गाव पातळीपर्यंत पोहोचवण्यासाठी आणि ते काम पूर्ण करण्यासाठी आमच्यासारख्या महिला खूप तळमळीनं काम करतात. तर त्यांना ह्याच्यामध्ये सहभागी केलं तर त्या चांगल्या पद्धतीनं होऊ शकतो. आणि महिलांना फक्त पैसेच नाही, तर त्यांना निर्णय क्षमतेमध्ये सुद्धा घ्यायला पाहिजे. आणि दुसरं की त्यांच्यासोबत पार्टनरशिप करून हे काम करायला पाहिजे. आणि क्लायमेट चेंजची जी पॉलिसी आहे, तर ती पॉलिसी डिझाईन करताना सुद्धा महिलांचा सहभाग त्याच्यामध्ये घ्यायला पाहिजे. धन्यवाद.
Absolutely, absolutely. Godabra is terribly inspiring, very, very inspiring. Congratulations for the efforts, because it's a real example of self-empowerment and resilience coming directly from the communities. And also how you've really started from India, but have taken it to Indonesia and to Africa, and how you sailed the pandemic, actually making it possible for these women to keep on going. So thank you so much. I know we don't have a lot of time left in this first round, but give me a short answer, in a minute or so before we go into the questions and answers. What could be your message to the financial institutions to make sure that the right financial mechanisms are getting to the communities?
हे वाढवण्यासाठी जे काही ग्लोबल फंडर आहेत किंवा इंटरनॅशनल ऑर्गनायझेशन आहेत किंवा जे लोकल लेवलला जसं की उमेद MSRLM आहे किंवा लोकल बँक आहेत आणि गव्हर्नमेंटचं जे डिपार्टमेंट आहे, तर ह्या लोकांनी की असं एक फंड डिझाईन करायला पाहिजे की ते कम्युनिटीच्या हातात जायला पाहिजे. आणि फंड डिझाईन करताना त्यात महिला सहभागी करून घ्यायला पाहिजे की जेणेकरून प्रोडक्ट डिझाईन चांगलं होईल आणि ते लोकांपर्यंत जाईल.
And don't you worry, we have translation, thanks to Nassim. Nassim, tell us.
So, Godavari is saying कि when we were designing like there are a lot of institutions around us, like main stakeholder is government and government various department like agriculture department, women and child welfare department, so many departments are there, and as well as the local financial institutions, banks. So they have to think about this opportunity, how the money can be go to scale up the impact at community level, and community women should be involved into the product designing, what kind of product or what kind of financial assistance they require. So it will get implemented nicely, and we will see the impact. Thank you.
Thank you so very much, Nassim. Thanks, Godavari. Thanks a lot. So we go now into the question and answer segment. I have here, there's magical hands in the back, making sure that I have got the questions that you've been sharing on slido.com. Obviously, this is also the opportunity for all our panelists to react to anything you have heard, isn't it? Let me read a couple of the questions that I have already got, and as you answer, feel absolutely free. We have quite a few, so I think I'm going to take them probably in 2 rounds. And our participants are already addressing some of you with those questions, but of course, if other panelists you would also like to come in, by all means, please do it. So there is a first question that is addressed to Alessandro, and the question reads, how to attract local community to participate in decision-making processes? A very local, hands-on question, isn't it? We have a question for Same or Tisa, that's the way it's been addressed. Is it possible to create a local green fund? Local users to services in disaster risk reduction could pay a contribution to a finance fund, for instance. Tisa, another question to you. Are financial models on offer innovative enough? Is it that grassroots designed, or the grassroots are adapting their challenges to fit in the funding models that exist? Let me take another one that, if you want, it's a bit, I guess, for Same, or perhaps, I would say, for any of you, perhaps, Godavari, you would also want to answer. An international financial framework that could produce guidelines to help governments to properly fund and regulate projects towards disaster risk reduction, could that be useful? So, a first initial round, your opportunity as well to comment on what you've heard from your peer panelists. Let's go. Who wants to go first? Who feels ready? Same? I can see you looking at me. Go ahead.
Thanks. Excellent questions, and I wanted to say excellent interventions by my fellow panelists. So on the local green fund, I think this is a great idea. I think one of the approaches that we try to do at the World Bank is to create basically financial flows and systems that could incentivize the type of action we'd like to see. So one of the systems we have is we look at national government. As you all know, municipalities receive financial transfers from national government. They tend to be ad hoc financial transfers, subject to politics, not clearly how they're getting to flow. So here we, in a line of interventions at the World Bank, we support national governments set up those systems of intergovernmental fiscal transfers, which transfer funds to local governments on the basis of clear, transparent formulas. So for instance, something about poverty headcount, something about population headcount, something about the lack of access to infrastructure and services becomes the metrics by which local governments receive this type of support. But this is the entitlement portion, if you want, and just making it transparent, multi-year budgeting. Then you add to it a performance component, something that tries to incentivize local governments to take the right type of actions, like, for instance, setting up a local green fund or investing in scaling up adaptation. Now, in which case, you put clear performance metrics for local governments to invest in, and if they achieve these objectives, then you add a top-up performance component. So by putting a systems like that, it creates the incentive for local governments to achieve, the policy objectives that have been preset in return to access funds. Of course, we do understand that not all local governments have the same level of capacity, so you try to embed capacity building to ensure that, if you will, those municipalities with less capacities are not left behind. In terms of an international framework, I don't know if those things work or do not work. I mean, I would tend to think putting in place any system of incentives, that tries to create the right type of incentives for action by local or national government probably has better chances to work. And maybe while I have the mic, a couple of reactions, because I thought Tisa made really excellent points. Her point on resilient metrics is really, really important. However, I think, and that's something that we're taking at the World Bank, so we're introducing something called the resilient rating system. And here we rate projects by the way they have taken into account resilience thinking in their design. Now, it does not mean that you have embarked on taking on the resilience enhancing intervention, because the cost benefit could be not worthwhile. You can decide that, listen, I can build a bridge to a 20-year standard versus a bridge to a 200-year standard. That is just 1 to 200-year standards is a great idea. It just costs too much. So here you acknowledge that you are taking, a suboptimal, maybe investment decision from a resilience perspective, but because of a trade-off in terms of cost benefit. And then, of course, by investing in preparedness, you reduce, if you will, the risk and the vulnerability. So it's just a matter of taking it into account, irrespective of whether, if you will, the cost benefit leads to it or not. I think the other point that you made, this is excellent, which is, lots of the funding goes for mitigation. We're trying really to scale up adaptation. It's what most developing countries need and urgently want. And here, one of the things that we found to be pretty interesting is to try to find that sweet spot, which is the type of interventions that basically have, if you will, can meet the two dimensions. So the most obvious one is nature-based solutions. I mean, investing in mangroves, investing into expanding the tree canopy, green areas, etc., have both a mitigation perspective in terms of, acting as a carbon sink and the heat island effect and whatever, but also have a major resilience enhancing impact in terms of, the reducing the stormwater runoff, serving, to absorb flood water, etc., and reducing the risk, enhancing, if you will, the resilience of slopes against landslides, etc. So here, trying to find the type of interventions that could fit, if you will, both needs.
Okay.
Could be one way of going forward, as one, if you will, enhances and provides the opportunities for financing on the adaptation side, which, as you rightly said, are lacking.
Thanks very much, Same. Let me go to Alessandro. Well, Tisa and Godabri start preparing their answers as well. Alessandro, the question to you is about engaging the local community in decision making. So how do you go about it? How do you go about it on a day-to-day in Potenza?
Yes, thank you. It's a very good question. It's a very good theme to discuss about, because this is the core of the business of a local government, to engage citizens, to engage civil society. As you know, of course, government has the main action is devoted to society, to the citizen. So, and this is strategic, how to engage them in the process. In our experience, we are passing through different phases for this engagement, because it is impossible to think about an engagement that can be done on the paper. You have to deal with the people, you have to deal with different kind of civil society groups. So you have to think about different techniques to engage and to be trusted by the people. So we have to perform different kind of methods, of activities, of actions for engaged communities. And first, you have to hear their needs. You have to give the possibility to them to express their needs and to ask for support, for the support of the government. And in this way, it starts the communication between the government and the society. Then you have to engage them in a sort of progressive steps of participation, consultation, participation, and then final engagement. Final engagement and give them also the possibility to own their action. As we saw in this intervention that we had today, most of the action comes from the people, and the government must have the ability to catch this ability of the people to give the action and to make own to take advantage of this possibility that we have. And it is a continuous process of consultation, participation, engagement, and ownership that goes for different kind of thematics. This is what we are doing in our provinces. We established permanent platform for this kind of engagement. We divided ideologically the community in different groups, and we engage them differently regarding the issues or the topic or the matter in which we want to engage them. In this way, we have the possibility to work with them, and sometimes also the possibility to give them pieces of the action to be governed by the civil society, by these groups. In this continuous process, the ambition that we have is to have a sort of unicum government, let's say also stakeholder, because stakeholders are also a fundamental part of this process, but mostly the citizen. This is working for us, but is a very long process of continuous feedback, because you have to provide trust and you have to provide feedback all the time, otherwise you lose the trust of the people. But it's hard work, but this is what the government has to do.
Exactly, it's a day-to-day job of government, isn't it? Thank you so much, Alessandro. So, this group of questions that were addressed to Tisa and to Godabri, I'm going to read them again because they are somehow interconnected, and that way you have a bit more of, latitude to decide how you go about them. So, are financing models on offer innovative enough? Are they designed with grassroots in mind, or is it that the grassroots communities are adapting to the challenges of trying to use those financial mechanisms? The rates for that type of financing grassroots organizations, are they worth trying, or are they increasing poverty? So, are they increasing what? In poverty. So, a bundle of questions here. Who would like to go first? Perhaps, who feels ready? Tisa, you go. Godabri, we'll go to you afterwards. Yeah? Thanks.
Yeah. I'll also try, in the course of my answer, to speak of the local green fund as well, because there was a question earlier that was also addressed to me.
I was going to address it afterwards, but if you feel like it, go ahead.
It's part of the same answer. Are local green funds useful? Yes, I would say. And I'll interpret funds broadly here to mean any institution that provides finance, basically. And local could also mean different things. It could mean at the national level, it could mean at the municipal level, it could mean at the district, even the village level. And from my observation, funds that exist on a more higher level have a bigger pool of funding, and they look for larger scale projects. And there is less access for participatory decisions on the use of those funds by the local communities. The lower you get down the level, you go into village level funds, the more it provides the opportunity and access for participatory decision-making by the grassroots community on what to use those funds for, but also the pool of funding is, limited. So this is very important when we're talking about adaptation finance, because adaptation programs, as I said before, can be small scale, it can be nature-based solutions, it could be household level, and those kinds of projects absolutely have difficulty accessing the big scale funds. Even at the national level, for example, if we say Indonesia has the Environmental Fund Agency, it has the SDG Indonesia 1 Fund, it has the ICCTF, the Adaptation Fund. It's notoriously difficult to access those funds, especially for grassroots local communities. But when we talk about there's village level interventions, there's cooperatives that exist in villages, there are village-owned enterprises that have actually provided some really innovative financing for resilience programs. We can't overlook that. But the problem is the scale is small, and so they tend to get overlooked. Yeah? So there needs to be a way to kind of marry the lessons learned from the big scale and the large scale and reduce the information asymmetries again, and have everyone on the same page basically as to what really matters to the real people that are suffering real consequences on the ground.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. Godavari, over to you, please.
जसं की आम्ही पण म्हणजे वेगळ्या ह्याच्यासाठी पण देऊ शकतात की प्रोड्युसर कंपनी आहे, परत फेडरेशन आहेत, बचत गट आहेत किंवा लहान लहान जे व्यावसायिक महिला आहेत, तर हे पण फंड त्याच्यामध्ये देऊ शकतात. आम्ही आमचा जे फंड देतो CRA फंड, तर त्याची एक सिस्टम तयार केलेली आहे, एक प्रोडक्ट डिझाईन केलेलं आहे की कुठल्या काळामध्ये हे घ्यायला पाहिजे आणि त्यांनी कसं परत करायला पाहिजे. तर त्यांनी आम्ही पण आपत्तीच्या वेळेला जसं आत्ता कोविड होता, तर कोविडमध्ये आम्ही शेतात पेरणी करण्यासाठी झिरो व्याजदरावर आम्ही त्यांना 6 महिन्यासाठीचे पैसे दिले, कारण गरजेच्या वेळेला पैसा मिळाला पाहिजे आणि त्यावेळेसच लोकांना महत्त्व वाटतं ते, आणि त्याच्या गरजा पण पूर्ण होतात. तर त्याच्यासाठी आम्ही
I think Nasim needs,
आणि ह्याच्यामध्ये आत्ता कारण कोविडमध्ये ज्यावेळेस लॉकडाऊन पडलं, लॉकडाऊनच्या नंतर खूप लोकांना बँकेत जाणं किंवा येणं होत नव्हतं, तर आम्ही ऑनलाईन पैसे त्यांना टाकले आणि तिथून लोकांनी मग त्यांना एवढं सहज इझी वाटलं की ऑनलाईन त्यांच्यापर्यंत पैसे मिळाले.
So Godavari is saying we created our own financial systems, which how the money can reach to the hands of community. So we are giving through the we have Farmers Producer Federation and Farmers Producer Organization and the groups. So the money is going through the group direct in the hands of women. And the demand comes to up to the federation, and we do the appraisal. And she's given the example ki always when we are after giving the loans, we goes there and we collect their utilization and see the impact, and based on the impact we are designing the products in our we are designing the product, how we can, what kind of funds we have to give to the community. And also she is saying ki during the COVID they did appraisal online, and the money, because after immediate COVID there is a agriculture season and they don't want to lose that period because our economy is depend on the agriculture. So the money, all the appraisal process is done online, and the money went back to the women's account, and they utilized for the agriculture season, and after 6 months the money came back. So 100% recovery is also there. So this kind of mechanism we have to create to reach out the community level financial institution.
Thank you so much. And actually, with this response, Godavari, and thanks Nasim for the translation, you have already responded to the question that was addressed to you about how was the participation of women developing best place, what were some of the mechanisms that you had in place to make the money flow. Thank you so much. Now, speakers, we are going into a bit of crunch time now. We are fine, but we have something like 15 minutes super maximum to take another round of questions amongst all of you. And actually, each of you have a question coming from the audience. So I'm going to ask you perhaps to be a bit shorter to what you've been in this initial round. If we are doing fine, we can then give you the opportunity to elaborate a bit more as we move to the conclusions. So I'm going to read them all, so you have a bit of time to think. I don't know who should I put play first, in the spot, but I'm going to read as they are, and then whoever feels ready will give me a sign, and we'll take it that way. So Tisa, there is a question for you here. Actually, it comes from a colleague from the GIZ, from the German corporation, and they are asking us, do you think that the development and implementation of taxonomy of sustainable finance, sustainability finance, will change the flow to provide funds for resilience on the local level? Same, to you. How about social bonds for DRR projects, social bonds for DRR projects insured or underwritten by World Bank patient capital investment? Are there any examples? Godabri, question to you. You mentioned that you work with local government, didn't you? So the question is asking us, did the local government integrate the assistance they provided as a long-term policy and planning? And by the way, the person who's asking that question is congratulating you for your excellent work. And Alessandro, the question to you is asking us, will Potenza Resilience Hub be applicable for rural areas too? Does it involve joint funding? Has there been a similar resilience hub for rural villages? So you have 3 questions in one. Is the Resilience Hub oriented as well to rural work? Is there any funding involved? Have you got any previous experience of resilient targeted towards the rural areas of your province? So, do you feel ready?
Yes.
Oh, Tisa is super ready. 15 seconds? No, not 15 seconds. We have 15 minutes across all of us. So, no, 15 seconds, it would be torture almost. So, I'm just asking you to be perhaps a bit shorter, each of you, but come on, let's keep the flow. We're doing great.
Will sustainable taxonomy change the flow of finance? Yes, that's very useful. That's the short answer. I have a kind of a story, well, part of a study that CPI did was that we noticed a sharp increase in private sector finance to ESG programs in 2018, which was coincidental with the time that the Financial Services Authority issued a regulation on sustainable finance that required the banking sector and financial institutions to have a certain portfolio of finance going towards ESG projects. But when we looked deeper into what was financed, most of it was to social. So like small, medium-sized enterprises, very popular as a target of financing, but not necessarily not necessarily environmental. So these kinds of things, taxonomies, sustainability taxonomies will solve, because the banks, the financial institutions are basically looking to be spoon-fed. Just tell us where we need to invest to fulfill, the E. And as taxonomies, just one more note is that taxonomies are not perfect. At the moment, different countries, different regions have different taxonomies. Indonesia has just ventured into issuing a first version of their green taxonomy, and I would say it's far from perfect. But they are needed, and we need to keep a close observation of those taxonomies to make sure they're as tight as we'd like them to be.
Excellent. So the devil is in the detail for those taxonomies, sort of. Sami, the question to you was very specific, isn't it? A potential role for the World Bank there in underwriting, or isn't it? Yeah.
So the type of financing that the World Bank avails is basically financing to, the World Bank has 2 arms, IBRD and IDA, so International Bank for Reconstruction and Development, middle-income countries. IDA is the International Development Association, low-income countries receiving subsidized funding. Those 2 vehicles of funding finance basically projects put forward by government and with a sovereign guarantee from government, because they are, at the end of the day, debt. Even though the terms are pretty concessional, they remain debt. And in this case, and some of these projects have financed basically what amounts to being, poverty alleviation-driven investments. That's the main objective of what we do, but I'm talking about, for instance, community-driven development, where, transfers of funds, including in Indonesia. We've had 2 major programs for urban poverty alleviation and rural poverty alleviation, so PNPM and UPP. The acronym will mean something to those of you who might know these projects. And these types of interventions do achieve these objectives, but it requires a sovereign guarantee from the national government. However, I think if you are going to be lending to government, and that's our main take, there's a lot of innovative approaches until they become boring, so things like, green bonds, social impact bonds, etc. But at the end of the day, the departure point is if you want to have these types of financial instruments, you need government to have, if you want to issue a green bond, you need to be able to issue a regular bond to start with, and then we eventually figure out the way to proceed to better terms under green financing. And that requires quite a bit of investment into creditworthiness, into building the fundamentals of local government finances, revenue mobilizations, expenditure rationalization, being able to better manage assets, etc., so that you can have, if you will, the wherewithals and the creditworthiness that allows to be able to embark on these types of transactions. At the end of the day, I mean, the two twin goals driving the World Bank's work are, alleviating extreme poverty and basically boosting shared prosperity. By that we mean reducing, if you will, the inequalities that face the bottom 40% of the population. So whatever it is, it has a social impact driver at the foundation of it. Yeah.
Thanks so much, Sami. So, Godabri, the question, if you remember, was about the integration by local government of the practices they learned in collaboration with you in their long-term planning.
आम्ही ज्यावेळेस प्लॅनिंग हे करतो तर त्यावेळेला प्रायव्हेट बँकेची किंवा फायनान्सची मदत घेतलेली आहे डिझाईन करताना. पण आमचं हे जे रिझिलियन्सचं काम आहे ते बघून जसं की दुष्काळामध्ये आम्ही काही महिलांना आजोला असेल किंवा कोंबडी पालन शेळीपालन करण्यासाठीचे आम्ही पैसे दिलेले, तर ते काम चांगलं झालेलं बघून गव्हर्नमेंटनं परत त्याला एक स्कीम बनवली की जास्त लोकांना ते देता येईल ह्याच्यासाठीचे.
So, in short, Godavari is saying that when we are designing our financial products, we took help of private sector bank managers and all. But when we are working at the community level, the government officials, especially during the drought, when we are supporting to the women to do the fodder, like the one product is for the fodder, to secure the fodder for animals. So, and the drought-prone enterprises, because that time we are not having agriculture income, so we are promoting key short-term drought-prone enterprises. So, the two products are bringing more impact. So, government learned from us, and they immediately created, turned into the scheme, government scheme, and the money goes more people through the government.
Excellent, thank you very much. And I appreciate a lot the effort you are doing to stay concise and this interpretation support. Thank you so very much. Alessandro, so the question for you and Potenza was very much about any rural dimension, isn't it, of the work in the Resilience Hub, and also whether there is any funding associated to the Resilience Hub.
This is an important point for an important action that for the province of Potenza that we are running since many years. We are working in this way since beginning of the 2000s. So we have during time we had we have the capacity and the capability to fund many kinds of interventions, especially in infrastructures. And this way of action, this way of searching, looking for fundings, for new investments, for local development, is made by different kind of action that we are running. One of these is international cooperation. We trust a lot on peer-to-peer exchange, in which we can learn, we can export our experience, or we can learn also from other successful experiences that we have all around Europe, all around Italy, not only in our local context. And we we can import these kind of experiences in our region by finding also a way to import them, to finding the opportunity to become now a resilience hub is for us a good way to increase our capacity, of course, by exporting our experience up to now, but also by trying to attract other partnership all around the world in order to establish a sort of mutual cooperation, and by the knowledge of the opportunity that we have, the local government have, to attract or to use different kind of fundings, we want to start a new development process that engage other kind of multiply the actions. And this is why we are now, we can use this, the Resilient Hub opportunity to increase our capacity of working together with others, but especially for the local community.
Thank you so much. Well, you've done excellently well in timekeeping, in content and timekeeping, both things. So we are now 20 minutes to the end of the event. We are okay. We know we have your concluding remarks. Let me throw at you a challenge. There is a question here, 2 questions that are actually worth a full conference. But let's see if any of you could like to say any quick thoughts, and then we move into the conclusions. If you remember, each of you has 3 minutes for the conclusions. So, brace yourselves. Why do you think that some large amount of money coming from international funds, there is an example given here, the European Union funds, for instance, are not used? Why do you think those funds remained unused? And then, a small question. How do we transform the climate finance architectures and procedures to make sure that they better meet the needs and demands of local communities? So as you can see, worth a conference, each of these questions. So I need somebody who literally, in a 1-minute answer, gives us any thoughts, further food for thought, over coffee, over corridor conversations, and then I move into the conclusions for each of you with your 3 minutes. So who wants to go? Tisa, I can see you there already ready. Go.
I shall attempt to answer the first question, because it is true. There are 3 problems. Number 1 is that there isn't enough international finance. We know from last year's COP that the international community has not fulfilled its $100 billion pledge, so there's not enough. But then the second problem is that when there is enough, it's committed to the developing countries are not able to access it. And the third problem is, even when the developing countries are able to access it, they have trouble disbursing it. So we have a 3-tier problem here. And in order to solve this issue, we need to address all 3 problems. But I'll start with the bottom. I'll start with the disbursement aspect.
If you could keep it brief, Tisa, really, so I can give perhaps others an opportunity.
Sure,
yeah?
sure.
Thanks.
But I could also stop there. I mean,
no, we're not going to leave you now. We're going to leave everybody now with
sure,
you.
because it takes the whole conference. Sure, but you know, it is difficult. Global funds have various different requirements, and you know, if I talk to funds based in Indonesia, I talk to the Environmental Agency Fund or the PTSMI, which has the SDG Indonesia 1 fund. What they say is it's so difficult to access these funds. They have different requirements. Different funders have different requirements. It's hard to keep up with. We have other things to do than to keep tabs of all these different requirements from different funders. So I think it would be helpful to have a streamlined requirement, have one standard that fits for all, and you know, agree on that. And also the other problem is the disbursement problem, which is pipelines. Again, pipelines. We don't have pipelines, they say. We have all these funds. We don't know where to send it to because none of the proposals are coming in.
Good. I suspect that Sam is going to want to address some of these questions. Let me check on this side. Sam, go ahead.
So I fully agree with Tisa. I think the point about pipelines is particularly important. I mean, the political economy surrounding donors and, you know, and the requirements is probably, you know, we can spend conferences talking about it. I think we just live with that. I think if we manage to avail pipelines of investment that are ready, shovel-ready, that are ready to be implemented, I think we will have unblocked, in my opinion, the biggest obstacle of all. And it's not just that donor funding is not being spent. Actually, national funding is not being spent. When I used to live and work in Brazil, I mean, Brazil, on average, during those years, was spending 60 to 70% of their own public investment budget let alone what they would get from international donors. So if you can't invest your own public investment budget, then there is a planning and a project preparation bottleneck. And this is something that we're really focused on at the World Bank, because we feel that is the most complex obstacle of all. Your second point about how can you transform the climate finance architecture, to take into account locally led adaptation needs, just make it the main criterion for the allocation of funding.
Okay, yeah. Easy said, but we've been trying, isn't it? Done, yeah. I don't know if on this side of the table anybody would like to address these questions. Let me look at you. Yes, Alessandro? If that was a yes or? Yes, go ahead.
The problem of international fundings, in our case, for example, we use international fundings for many kind of things, especially for transnational cooperation. We are in the European Union, we have also some structural funds for investment for infrastructure, but this is not the case that I want to speak. I want to raise the attention that one mechanism that we can use if we provide for a resilient territory, the possibility to attract private investment. This is what some mayors of our community are experimenting now. They provided, after they have put the basis for resilient housing, resilient infrastructure, resilient infrastructure at the city level. Now they are working together to find out if some private investment can be can be brought to the territory. This means that dealing with the private investors, such as Costa Concordia, for example, a company of boat, ship travels, that stops in a port, in a harbor near our region, is 100 kilometers, how to facilitate that people from that, coming from all around Europe, that stop there, can come to our city or to our province to visit or to. But if you from doing this, you need to have a resilient, a safe territory, a safe to put as a part of the investment. This is a good piece of action that can be done at the local level to attract new kind of investments.
Thank you so very much. We've tried our most to take as many questions as possible. I am aware that there's more coming in, but this is when we really need to start wrapping up. So I really wanted to thank you in the room and thank, of course, the online participants for giving us the opportunity of having a lively conversation. I think you've done an excellent job, panelists, so you will get a round of applause later on. It's well deserved. So now is when we move to the conclusions. Each of you could have your 3 minutes maximum. What would you like our participants to get home, to the takeaways? What new thing perhaps have you also learned listening to your fellow panelists? So I'm going to start, I think, Alessandro, followed by Same, followed by Tisa, and last but not least, we leave it to the grassroots leaders, to Godgovi, to give us a bit of the taste here. So let's go.
So, main conclusion, of course, my perspective is that of a local government, so I cannot I cannot go out from this role. So, as the first general point is my opinion, of course, the opinion of the government in where I work, and also for the president that put the message, the key message today. As the first general point, I will stress the need for a global call to action. If we want to have a disaster-resilient world, we need to act now, locally and globally. It means that our actions must be localized, but it must include all the globe. The second general requirement regards the strategy to be adopted. Tangible and concrete actions are needed and take place at the very local level. So the approach should be from national strategies to local actions. This is my view. So we need a more empowering to local governments. National governments must facilitate, drive, and ensure more authority to local governments for providing support, resources, adequate resources for their action. And then we have three specific objectives that needs to be achieved. Resilience building is always a government issue. Local government must take the lead of the process. For achieving this, access to information, capacity building, resources are critical issues that must be assured to them for enhancing their capability in performing actions. Then there is the critical role of stakeholders and civil society. Local government must set up and continuously feed and lead the platform of multi-stakeholder and community engagement in all the process of their mandate. This gives them the ability to inclusively widen their reach and to increase their range of action. And last but not least, local governments must increasingly use the strong potential tool that now we have as institutional community. Partnerships, twinnings, peer-to-peer exchange, these are powerful mechanisms for enhancing the political support, learn from each other, exchanges best practice and successful experiences, and consequently for multiplying knowledge and investment opportunities for resilient development. This is my findings, in my opinion, for today.
Thanks very much, Alessandro. Same.
So I agree with Alessandro. He didn't leave me much to say, but let me add a couple of points. One is project preparation is key. There's money out there, not enough, but there's money out there, and project preparation will definitely help, utilize some of that money. There's also, value in adaptation that could be monetized, and in particular in urban areas where investments in de-risking these urban areas, flood mitigation and the like, creates value in urbanization that could be monetized through land value capture and the like. And lastly, nature-based solutions are, one of those amazing opportunities to both achieve adaptation but also achieve mitigation, and therefore being able to tap that other source of funding that seems to be a bit more abundant out there. So 3 small nuggets. Yeah.
Thank you. Very important nuggets, though, absolutely. Tisa, please.
I thought I'd end with an anecdote from Jakarta, my hometown, and a city familiar to many here because it is the fastest sinking city in the world, according to some headlines. When we look at the finances in Jakarta, the climate finance flows to the giant seawall mostly, although it's a controversial project, it's been shut down. But the fact remains that it is the largest single committed finance for a climate action in Jakarta. And most of that financing comes from the central government because Jakarta is a capital city and it receives capital city privileges. As a result, no private finance, very, very few private finance contributes to climate action in Jakarta. So I wanted to use that anecdote to wrap up what I said previously. There does need to be an unlocking of public finance. What happens if Jakarta stops being a capital city, which it is planning to stop being a capital city as soon as 2024, I believe. They will stop receiving central government funding. It will need to think of how to become self-sufficient. So it really needs to unlock public finance by having impact metrics that can unlock public finance for adaptation. Number 2, we can't be complacent with the availability of public finance. We also need to unlock private finance, and that's where we need to, shoot public interventions to de-risk adaptation projects and make sure that projects are available, are bankable, and it does not necessarily need to be innovative. At some point, all these innovative financial interventions need to be big, boring, and repetitive. Thank you.
Excellent. Godavari, please.
सेंडाई फ्रेमवर्कच्या जे मिड टर्म रिव्ह्यू आहे तर त्याच्यामध्ये महिलांनी केलेल्या कामाचा अभ्यास करायला पाहिजे की जसं महिला काय काम करतात की चांगलं करतात का त्याच्यातून त्यांचा कसा इम्पॅक्ट झाला आहे हे असं सगळ्याचा अभ्यास करायला पाहिजे आणि त्यांना शासनाने नियोजनमध्ये घ्यायला पाहिजे आणि नियोजनमध्ये घेऊन त्यांची क्षमता पण बांधणी करायला पाहिजे.
So Godavari is saying that there is an opportunity to of Sendai midterm review. So we have to take that opportunity and find out the community-led, women-led financial mechanisms, and see what kind of system and processes they are following and what kind of impact they brought through their own systems. So that can be included into the midterm review, and women has to involve into the design of financial mechanism, so they can say what are their priorities, their needs, and the system which will be implemented at grassroots level. So this is her request, and as well she is requesting if we are agreed to give the financial mechanism at the grassroots level, their capacity also has to build how they have to own and they run the system and processes.
Well, I think they all deserve a very big round of applause, so please, come on. Thank you. Well, I think you would agree with me that it's been an extremely rich discussion. I hope it has really, as I was saying earlier, provoked further thoughts in you. So when you go out to the corridors or continue the conversations in the online platform, you could, build upon what you've heard. We heard a lot of things. We started with the notion of risk-aware political commitment. We heard as well about placing communities at the very center of the planning, but also, of course, of the design of those mechanisms, about the importance of localizing and contextualizing the decisions and the tools. We heard about the notion of global public goods that should be preserved and protected, and therefore how we unlock the public and the private finance that should go to them. We heard about metrics for adaptation. We heard about how do we monetize the value that really exists in those adaptation measures. We heard about the importance of innovative mechanisms, but also of the big, boring and repetitive funding mechanisms that exist there. We heard about project preparedness, about also looking at the impact, whether the impact is really happening or not from those mechanisms. A lot of things that are really very much at the very center of making sure that any financing mechanism is creating the impact in the local communities and in the local governments, and therefore being accessible to it. I still have a few housekeeping messages to leave with you, so you know what is happening next, and also you help us continue with the conference. The next session will be starting in 45 minutes. I, of course,